back. We are continuing this study of strange scriptures with session 6. We're calling this one The Sun Stopped. So just as a little review, we've discussed that the main goals of this study, of course, is to understand that there are unusual passages in the Bible. We might call them strange, we might call them peculiar, we might even call them weird. And they may be difficult to understand at times, but the goal here is to understand them, or at least get a better understanding of them. And we understand that that Proverbs 3:5 is kind of our guide through this study, that we may not be able to understand all of these passages, or at least all the passages in the scripture, because we don't have all the information regarding some of the things that are referenced, but we can trust God, of course, that He, of course, has the answers, and He may not tell us right away, but we are going to not lean on our own understanding, as the verse says. Therefore, we're not going to try to reconcile some of these things with our own understanding. So we don't want to do that, because we get ourselves into trouble, and we might end up explaining it in too detailed of a manner, in a manner that we end up confusing it even more, or confusing other passages. So we just want to realize that we may not understand some of these things 100%. So we talked the last few times about the spirit world, how the spirit world is a literal location. It's not something that's make-believe or just kind of fuzzy and blurry, or whatever you want to call it, where it's tangible. So there's just because something is spiritual doesn't mean it loses any tangibility, if that's a word. We talked about the sons of God, or otherwise known as angels, direct creations of God, and how some of them decided to sin. And we talked about how they don't have salvation, probably because they're not faithful beings, meaning they're with God in a personal relationship all the time anyway. So they decided to mess up, and God said, sorry, I'm done with you guys. So there's good angels and there's bad angels. And then we talked about the Nephilim, which are the progeny of these bad angels and the daughters of men, or the human women, we would say. And the giants, or the Nephilim would be called the giants. And they existed before the flood, and as we see in Genesis 6, they existed after as well. And we talked about probably the most likely reason why they existed afterward is that there was we could call it a second incursion by disobedient angels. So because the first ones are locked away for the judgment. So now that said, then we talked about demons, of course, and demons being the spirits of these Nephilim, or these giants, after the flood destroyed them all. And so we've got several different classes, you could say, of evil beings and good beings in the spirit realm. Those being angels, those being higher demons, you could say. We might call them principalities. And then, of course, we have lesser demons, and just a whole range of you could say craziness going on in the spirit realm with all these beings. Of course, there's good ones, there's bad ones, and there's a literal spiritual war going on. So we see little hints of that throughout Scripture, including in Daniel chapter 10 and other places. But we also talked about this mysterious character last week, about Melchizedek, and the fact that it's not actually a name of a person, but it's a title of a priesthood. And we talked about who the man might possibly have been. We're not for sure. It doesn't really matter who the identity of the man was in this Genesis passage, but we talked about the name Melchizedek, how he's mentioned in a verse in Genesis, a verse in Psalms, and a few passages in Hebrews chapter 7 and others. So not that many places, but we talked about him. We talked about the priesthood of Levi, priesthood of Aaron, and the priesthood of Melchizedek, and that Jesus is not a member of Levi or Aaron, but a member of the Melchizedekian priesthood, and he's actually the final Melchizedekian priest. And we talked about some possible other candidates for the priest, the position of Melchizedek before Jesus. So there's some interesting things there, but tonight we're actually going to focus on a passage in Joshua. This is about the sun and the moon standing still. We see this in Joshua chapter 10. We're going to talk about it. It's called Joshua's long day to many. So most people know that as the day that Joshua prayed to God for the day to be extended so they could complete some of their military tasks. And of course, he answered the prayer and this happened. So we're going to talk about did this actually happen, or was it an allegory, or if it did happen the way it says, what are some possibilities on how this happened? We're going to talk a little bit about some astronomical terms to kind of understand how the sun and the moon could have stopped naturally, of course, by God, but we're going to talk about maybe how this could have happened, again, by God, but of course in a natural sense. Not that God didn't have anything to do with it, but that he fully controlled this event. But if he did this through different means, we'll talk about some of that. So I like to, one of my hobbies is astrophotography. So this is going to be real fun for me because we get to talk a little bit about astronomy and stuff like that. So if you're not an astronomy nerd like me, well, I apologize, but hopefully this will be a little more, this will be interesting to you when we delve into it. We're also going to talk about divine providence and chance. So that brings up the topic of coincidence. So does coincidence exist, or does God plan every little detail of every event? So we're going to talk about that. And it could be a little bit of both. We've seen some interesting and what I call paradoxes in Scripture where God is, controlling everything, but yet we have free will. Well, that doesn't make sense from a human's perspective, so we try to explain it. Oh, well, God does control everything, so we don't have free will, but this and that and the other. But when in reality we do have free will, God does control events, and God is aware of everything. Does that make sense 100%? Not really, not to us, but we do understand it to be true. So we just have to put our human understanding aside and understand that God is not 100% human. Jesus is obviously 100% human and God, but the mind of God is something we can't really fathom, at least now. So we have to just, again, put that aside and understand that God is God and we are not. So, all right, so we're going to jump right into the verses. First of all, we're going to jump into Joshua 10, which is where we get the title of the study. It's Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 to 13. And it says, "Then Joshua spoke to the Lord." This is key here because it looks like later he actually spoke to the sun and the moon, but he spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon, in the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, and the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. So very interesting. We see that there's this battle going on, and basically Joshua just needs a little more time. It's kind of tough to fight a battle when it's night. You can't see anything. Obviously, they didn't have high-powered lighting or just any kind of extra light that could provide them any sort of direction or identification of the enemy. So he said, God, please just give us a little more time so we can finish this. And of course, God answered and said, okay, and did it. So we're going to talk about possibly how he did that. And of course, we see it's mentioned in the book of Jasher. We have mentioned Jasher a few times throughout this study. And I want to point out that the book of Jasher that we have now may not be the full or the same book of Jasher that this is referring to, at least not completely. There's more evidence that the book of Jasher we have now may have been altered, fabricated in some places. So we don't want to say, oh, well, this is 100% because it's in Jasher. But we don't want to fully dismiss it either. We want to be careful about using this text because it may not be exactly what we have. Or what we had in the time of Joshua and so forth. Okay, so we see this event happening. We're going to talk about some astronomical terms later, not astrological, but astronomical. Of course, astrology is the study or the occultic practice of trying to divine your life by the movements of the stars and planets and so forth. And of course, astronomy is just the scientific study of the sky. So things in the sky, stars, planets, and nebula and stuff like that, galaxies and so forth. Okay, so I have planned it. That's another verse we're going to talk about right now, and it's in Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 through 11. This is getting into the topic of coincidence or how God plans things out in history. So it says, "Remember the former things long past, for I am God and there is no other." So he's talking about things before the writing of this verse. And it says, "I am God and there is no one like me." Okay, well, that includes us. So we are not like God. We are creations of God. We're actually sons of Adam. Adam is a direct creation of God, and we are, you could say, children of Adam. It says, "Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it." Okay, so there's a lot in this little verse here. So it says, remember the things long past, for I am God, there is no other. I am God, there is no one like me. Declaring the end from the beginning. Okay, that basically is just God saying, I have declared all history. So that means I have planned it, I have established it. God is saying that he controls all of history, so he has declared all of it. And it says, "And from ancient times things which have not been done." So he's saying things which have not happened yet, so future things, I've declared those. So, and things from ancient, so basically from ancient times all the way to the future, I have declared those. So if you don't understand what declaring the end from the beginning means, he goes on to say, ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established. So his plan of all history basically will be established. And I will accomplish all my good pleasure. So he's saying that everything I want to happen will happen. He said, calling a bird of prey from the east. So something as simple as a bird traveling in the sky, the man of my purpose from a far country. So, I mean, everything from a bird to a man traveling for his purpose. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it. And that's pretty clear there, that basically God is saying he's planned everything and he will make sure it happens. So if you have kids and you say, you know what, son, I have planned this and I'm going to make sure it happens, or I'm going to make sure you do this. It's kind of the same thing, but of course that's from human perspective. God is a little more in control of things, so that's just an example, but not a great one, but you see where I'm going with that. Okay, the next verse is in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33, and it's the lot is cast. So this is another passage about coincidence and chance, and it says the lot, or the lots is when they cast like die. You could, if you want to think of a dice roll. So the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. So that means what you cast in your bet, you could say, or when you drop those dice on the ground, or those lots on the ground, the decision or the result of what is rolled isn't a chance. It's from God. It's every decision, not just some of them. It's every decision is from God. So God has made the decision of what those dice is going to roll. I know that's hard for us to understand. So if you go to the casino, or you're playing online gaming or something like that, just remember that those decisions, if you're doing really badly, that's from God. And I know that's kind of hard to explain that way, but it's true. That's Proverbs 16:33 confirms that. So if you're wanting to bet and make some money and you're doing badly, take that as a sign that maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe you shouldn't be using your money to try to make more. Now, if you're just having a little fun over there, I'm not going to get into the morality of betting with money, but just realize that every roll of a dice is basically, that decision or that result is from God. It's not just by chance. And does that mean that chance doesn't exist? Well, we're going to talk about that. So what we think of as chance is there's some problems with it, but we'll talk about that. So, and then we have another verse in Luke, and it's in Luke chapter 10, verse 31, and it's I'm calling it "and by chance," of course. So, and this is Jesus talking. It says, Jesus replied and said, and he's giving a parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I'd like to point this out that when in the scripture, when we're talking about traveling to and from Jerusalem, it's always down from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is thought of as higher up than everything else. So we always say down from Jerusalem, or up to Jerusalem. If you notice that, you'll see it in scripture. So just thought I'd point that out. It says down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. So he ended up in a bad place and threatened by some people. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down on that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So, of course, this is the Good Samaritan parable. Well, all these people keep passing by this unfortunate man that was beaten and robbed and left half dead. But people keep walking by, and again, they just pass by, and the Good Samaritan is who eventually stops. So the Greek here, by chance, literally just means by accident. So we have to wonder, if chance doesn't exist, is Jesus just using this parable and being facetious, or just being silly by saying "and by chance"? Or was it his providence or his plan that these people would walk by and not stop to help this man? That maybe a priest would walk by, someone that you would think would help someone, but then they just kept going. Is that just by accident, or was that on purpose? So I'm going to vote the latter, that it was on purpose. So, but, well, again, that's another topic which we'll talk about soon. And the next verse, of course, this is interesting because it's about the birth of Jesus. And we're going to talk about his star in the east. So this, of course, is in Matthew, the Christmas passage. This is the Magi, or the wise men, talking. And it says in Matthew 2:2, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." So this is a little more related to what we're talking about because it involves a celestial event, or an object in the sky, an astronomical object like a star. Now, there's a lot of debate about if this was an actual star, if this was a planet, if this was a conjunction, or basically two objects in the sky coming really close and looking like a star or a very bright object. In the year 2020, the Jupiter and Saturn actually came really close together, and they called it the Christmas star event. And I actually have a few pictures of it. And it was actually my real first attempt at astrophotography. So it didn't turn out great, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. But you have these two objects in the sky, seemingly very close together, but millions of miles apart. And since they were so close together, it looked very bright. So everyone calls it the Christmas star just because it's extra bright. And it was around December, so it was, holiday-wise, very appropriate to call it that. So was the star that was in Bethlehem a natural event set in motion maybe at creation? Maybe at creation God set this object or this event to happen at the exact right moment in time? Well, that's possible, or was this star, an actual manifestation of God's presence, or what we call the Shekinah glory, or Shekinah glory? Either pronunciation's fine. But that's one of those debates about that event. Was it an actual natural event that obviously God set in motion, or was it something that he had direct involvement in at that time and actually manifested as this star, this bright object? That's not really part of this discussion, but that's an interesting topic. I personally think it was the Shekinah glory because it moved unlike a star, and it rose in different places. They were actually in the east, moving to the west. So if they saw it rising from the west, that's not how stars rise. So who knows exactly? But the fact that it moved over the house where Jesus was, and it's really difficult to actually place an astronomical object over a location that's within your hemisphere that you're viewing the sky in. So anyway, not to get off on topic, but I don't believe it was an actual natural event, but that's it. I could be wrong. No big deal. Okay, moving on. Another verse in Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. This is, of course, the Red Sea crossing. I'm calling it a strong east wind. So this is says that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. So the question here is, was the wind set in motion as a natural event after the first winds blew on the earth, maybe at creation? Is that something that he just planned to happen at the exact moment? Or did he intervene right then and blow a wind across the sea? And either one's, I don't know. I tend to lean that maybe he intervened right then. So maybe all these things just happen right then by direct intervention of God. Or maybe it's something that he works into his plan from the moment of creation or from before creation. Because we know all of history, of course, was set in motion, as the scripture says, before the foundation of the world. So, okay, so we're going to jump into the explore session. And to really explore this event in Joshua, we need to kind of understand how the sun and the moon could stand still from a person standing on Earth. So there's several options here. I'm just going to talk about two. I mean, there could be 5 or 6 or 20 options, or more. But I'm just going to focus on two. Of course, option one, if the sun and moon stood still, how could this have happened? So option one, we could say that God just supernaturally stopped the earth from rotating for about a day with a snap of his finger, so to speak. Or we could say option two, that God used a seemingly natural series of celestial events to cause the earth to stop rotating for about a day. And again, there might be more possibilities, but for the purposes of this class, we're just going to focus on these two. So I'm saying the earth rotating, what does the earth rotating have to do with the sun and moon stopping? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand that the sun and moon are not actually moving in the sky, that the earth is actually rotating. And, well, the moon is moving, but the Earth's rotation on its axis actually causes the illusion that the moon and the sun are moving in certain ways. So we need to understand how celestial bodies move in space. So a rotation of an object equals 1 day. So when the Earth spins on its axis, or the imaginary line between the North and South Pole, it spins around, and as it spins around once, that gives us a day, or in the Hebrew, a yom. So when an object spins around itself once, is basically 1 day. That's how it works. Has nothing to do with the sun, except the sun gives us the light for the day, and the absence of light on the opposite side, or the shadow, you could say, that's caused by not being in view of the sun, gives us the night for that rest of that day or that night. So when the earth is in the view of the sun and that light is passing onto the surface of the earth, that gives us the daylight. So of course it starts out kind of dim and gets brighter and brighter, and around noon we're more direct on with the sun, and towards the evening and dusk and night, you could say twilight at night, and the point between night and day, that's the start of night and the end of the day. So another term is revolution, and not the political term, but a revolution equals 1 year for an object. So when the sun, or when the earth moves around the sun, as opposed to the earth moving around its own axis, when the earth actually spins around or moves or orbits around the sun, one spin around the sun is 1 year for the earth. So when an object, you could say when an object spins around its parent object once, or what it's orbiting, that's 1 day, or sorry, 1 year. So when Joshua was looking up and he sees the sun and the moon moving, you can see the moon in the daylight, by the way. That's no big deal. Obviously, the moon's in a different location. You can't see it the closer it gets. It's harder to see the closer it gets to the sun because the sun's so bright. But if the sun's in one part of the sky and the moon's in another, it's much easier to see in the daytime. So at one point, these things are obviously moving, but and of course you can't see them moving with your eyes unless you can't, because it's moving so slow to humans. So, but obviously at some point, the sun and the moon stop, and you might see the guys on the field going, man, shouldn't it be dinner time by now or dusk by now? But the sun and the moon are obviously not moving. So about another day goes by, or about a whole day goes by, an additional day from what the scripture says, before it starts moving again. So at some point, everyone's like, man, the sun's really been out a little longer than usual. So it would have been a longer day than expected. So the reason, again, getting back to the earth spinning, the reason why I say that possibly the earth stopped spinning and not the sun and the moon stopped is very likely, just because they both stop. He didn't say, he did ask for the sun and the moon to stop. So could God have just said, okay, sun and moon stop? Well, the fact that they're not moving to begin with, in our sky, from our perspective, the moon is a little bit, but to give it that appearance that the earth and the moon are moving, you have to have the earth moving. Or sorry, the sun and the moon are moving, you have to have the earth movement. So this is why I believe that the earth actually stopped moving. And therefore, to us, the sun and the moon stopped. So again, I could be completely wrong, but that seems to make the most sense. So moving on. Okay, so we're going to talk now about the sun for a second. So days are different depending on where an object is around the sun. So location is very important. So the sun is actually, it's really tough to say how long is a day on the sun, like a solar day, because an earthly day is about 24 hours. Day and night. Day is about 12 hours, night's about 12 hours, so the full day would be about 24 hours. And on the sun, it's actually different depending on where you are on the sun. So if you could stand on the sun's surface, a day is about 24 and a half Earth days instead of hours, and about 34 days at the pole. So if you're at the North or South Pole in the sun, your day is actually going to be a little longer, which again, a whole day on the sun is about 24 and a half Earth days. So it's much longer than a day on the Earth. So the sun actually also orbits something. Okay, so all the planets in the solar system orbit the sun, including comets and asteroids, some asteroids and so forth. But the sun itself actually orbits the center of our galaxy, which is a huge group of other stars. And our sun is just one of those stars. So a galactic year is what we call it when the sun actually makes a full orbit around the center of the galaxy. What do you think it is? About 50 Earth days or 1,000 Earth days? It's actually calculated to be about 225 million Earth years. So it's going to be a while before we get a whole year, assuming that we don't get a whole new heaven and earth by then. So the solar system is actually traveling. That means all of our planets and our sun is actually moving about 140 miles per second. So about 514 miles per hour in space around the center of the galaxy. So that, if that doesn't make your head hurt a little bit, or head spin, I guess I should say a little bit, then anyway, bad joke. So all planets, that includes dwarf planets, which are just smaller planets in our solar system, like Pluto is now considered a dwarf planet, and some comets and asteroids orbit the sun. So all planets, dwarf planets, and some comets and asteroids orbit around our sun, or our star. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the planets for a minute. So the planets themselves orbit around the sun. Of course, we know this. I mentioned this a minute ago. And every planet's a different distance from the sun. Therefore, our days and years will vary by different degrees, and also depending on different characteristics of our planets and orbits and so forth. So I'll just give you a few of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to give you an idea of how these vary. So Mercury's day is actually, instead of being 24 hours or 30 hours or 50 hours, it's about 58.6 or about 59 Earth days. So if you want to think about going to take a job on Mercury, which is a little close to the sun, so I wouldn't recommend it, and there's no atmosphere, your work day is about 1,408 hours total. So a regular 8-hour work day would be kind of nice on that planet. But the year on Mercury is actually very short, though. It's actually about 88 Earth days. So it's a very long day, very short year, almost or less than a quarter of an Earth year. Venus is a little different. Each day on Venus is actually about 243 Earth days. So a day on Venus is about 5,900 hours, roughly. What's different about Venus, though, and not that there's not very many differences, but the planet itself actually orbits backwards. So every planet's orbiting this, like we could say clockwise or actually counterclockwise, depending on how you look at it. But Venus is the opposite, goes the opposite direction. And we might talk about how exactly that could have happened. There's some theories out there about that, but there's some interesting ones that actually fit the biblical narrative. So, but the year is actually about half an Earth year, so about 220 Earth days, 225 Earth days on Venus. So it's a very long day, very short year, kind of like Mercury. Mars is a little special because it's very similar to Earth. The day is about 25 hours, 24.4 hours. So just a little longer than a regular Earth day. And since Mars is actually tilted a little bit like our planet Earth, it gives it similar seasonal changes, not similar seasons, but changes are about 4 seasons a year. But Mars's year is almost twice as long as our year, just because it's much further away from the sun. It's about 687 Earth days, so about 1.9 Earth years. Now, I do have all the other planets here, but I'm not going to cover all of those just because of time. It's just to give you an idea of how these years and days vary. So now we're going to talk about the moons. Moons are basically just objects that orbit planets. So similar to how the planets orbit the sun, planets have things that orbit them. And of course, we know that Earth has one moon. We call it the moon. Mercury has no moons. Venus has no moons. Mars has 2 moons. They're very small and very hard to see. Jupiter has, anyone guess, has about 69 or more moons that have been discovered. So quite a bit. Now, when Jupiter was first discovered through a very small telescope by Galileo, he saw 4 moons. Those moons are a little smaller than Earth, but they're big for moons. And you can see them with a very, even binoculars or a small telescope. But there's many more moons on orbiting Jupiter, and they're much smaller. Saturn has about 62. Uranus has about 27 moons. And again, this is what's been discovered, so there might be more. Neptune about 14 moons, and Pluto has 1 moon. So the movement of celestial bodies or objects from Earth's perspective, this is what we need to talk about to kind of understand the whole sun and moon stopping in the sky. So you need to understand that the sun and moon and other objects in the sky actually move a certain way throughout the sky from our perspective. So most planetary objects, I should say, wander along an imaginary line called the ecliptic. What's interesting is planets actually means, the word planet actually means wanderer. When astronomers many years ago, centuries ago, were studying the sky. They would see these, what they thought were stars, but they were moving. They were in different places every night. So they called them wanderers because they weren't really sure what they were. But they eventually, of course, many societies and cultures worshipped them, gave them godlike names, and those names stuck for the most part. So these because of the structure of our solar system and how we have the sun in the middle and then planets orbiting the sun, everything from our perspective tends to fall in a straight line. The objects are always lined up in the sky because of this. So I always laugh when someone says, "Hey, the planets, they're all lined up tonight." And what's true is that what's funny about that, I guess I should say, is that they're always lined up. Sometimes they're just a little more closer to each other than other times during the year. So when they get a little closer, everyone thinks that, oh, they're lined up. There's going to be something special happen. It's always the sign of something, people think. So, but the truth is they're always lined up in a certain way, just because of our perspective. So that said, the concept of the term up we're going to talk about it now, because when we walk outside and look up, we think we're looking straight up. Well, we're actually probably looking in the perspective of the galaxy and the solar system. We might actually be looking to the side, you could say. But the concept of up is more difficult than one might think. So I have a few diagrams on the study that show the first one on the left here is the celestial equator. The celestial equator is basically the imaginary line that extends out from the Earth's equator out into space. So it's not always necessarily what's in front of you or behind you or left or right, unless you're standing on the North Pole, I guess, or the South Pole. You're not going to have that exact celestial equator, but you can imagine the celestial equator being the imaginary line that extends from our earthly equator, which is, of course, in the middle of the Earth, the center of the hemisphere, the center of the Earth, extending out into space. So if we walk outside and look, our galactic plane from this picture is actually the flat pancake-like structure of our galaxy, visible to our eyes. So if you go outside and you see the Milky Way, and it's going straight up and down from your point of view, so you're actually, from the galaxy's point of view, you're laying flat on your side. So I know that's kind of hard to understand, but the galaxy is not perfectly lined up with the solar system. It's almost exactly opposite, actually. So the picture on the right, the little drawing on the right, is actually from the perspective of standing in line with the galactic plane, and that shows you kind of how the solar system's actually lined up, sort of. So it's, again, they're kind of flip-flopped. And then if you look at that picture at the bottom there, you'll see that the ecliptic, or how the solar system is lined up, actually is in comparison to the galactic plane, or the solar system plane, or the ecliptic plane. Again, the ecliptic is the imaginary line in the sky that all the planets and the sun and the moon travel along because of our orbits. So it's definitely not lined up with the galaxy, and that's fine. It's just to show you that, up is kind of a tough concept when you realize how everything's lined up. Okay, so from that, we're going to change gears and jump into a different topic. Now that we have a basic understanding of celestial objects and how they're viewed from the sky, or from Earth in the sky, we're going to talk about divine providence and chance. Okay, so that brings us to a term that everyone should be familiar with: coincidence. And of course, I have a definition of coincidence here, and it's a remarkable concurrence of circumstances without apparent causal connection. Okay, so that's a remarkable concurrence of circumstances without apparent causal connection. So let's just start out and tear this little definition apart. So a remarkable, that would mean seemingly like, wow, this is way more extraordinary than I guess you could say ordinary. This is something that's very unexpected, rare, you could say. And then you have concurrence of circumstances, or a harmony, you could say, of circumstances, or an agreement, or a related order of circumstances or events without apparent causal connection. So basically a whole bunch of things happening that seem related, but they're not. So there's no connection to them. Now that's the definition of coincidence. So the most simplest way I can probably put that is a bunch of stuff happening that seems related, but isn't related at all. It's just random. Okay. So what's interesting about that is Jewish rabbis have a saying in their circles that coincidence is not a kosher word. So what does that mean? Well, the word coincidence is not a kosher. Kosher is just a Hebrewism, a Hebrew word meaning like acceptable, proper, lawful. So if you're, say, in a Jewish setting or with some Jews, and you say, how about we have some bacon? They're going to say that's not kosher, or that's not something we do. We're not supposed to eat bacon. Or if you say, hey, let's have some unleavened bread, they'd probably say, oh, that's kosher. Or you can go to the store and buy some, kosher food. It's going to be food that's prepared in a Jewish or Levitical or lawful way. So Jews, again, have this saying, or those rabbis have a saying, that coincidence is not a kosher word. So coincidence is not an acceptable word. They don't believe in coincidence. And actually, coincidence is not a Hebrew word, or was not a Hebrew word originally. Okay, so coincidence is not something that in the Jewish mindset is really a valid or acceptable thing. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God is involved in everything, is even in the seemingly coincidental things. So what can God do? Here's a question we need to ask ourselves. What can God do? Well, almost everyone's going to say, well, anything. Well, the truth is, it's actually almost anything. He can't do some things, and I know that's going to upset people out there, but guess what? There are some things that even God can't do, and that's scriptural. So what can God not do? Well, in Titus 1:2, it says, in the hope of eternal life, which God, who cannot lie, promised long ages ago. So God can't lie. Okay, well, there's something God can't do, and now everyone's like, oh, okay, I see what you mean. So God can't sin. Well, that's actually an interesting discussion that I got into recently with someone, but the fact that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness and so forth to sin, he didn't, but he was tempted to. So could God have sinned, or could Jesus have sinned? Well, that's a whole nother discussion. I won't get into that here. It's an interesting question. I'm just glad he didn't sin. So, but yeah, God can't lie. He can't learn. If God could learn, we'd be in big trouble, because then we might disappoint him. But the fact that he can't learn means, well, in a way, he can't be disappointed in me, because he already knows everything about me. So, and the truth is, he could not pay for sin any other way than what he did with Jesus. Otherwise, he would have done it. Because Jesus himself even said, Lord, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, let your will be done, not mine. So, Jesus asked for another way, but obviously there was no other way. So God could not pay for sin any other way. So he can't lie, he can't learn, he can't pay for sin any other way. Honestly, that's all I have, but there might be other things God can't do. I'm just not going to dwell on that too much. But so if God can't learn, can he be unaware of anything? So that is the question. So if coincidence exists, if coincidence is a real thing, the way the world might define it, then the truth is that God cannot be involved in all events, because that means that things happen outside of God's understanding or God's awareness. Things considered coincidence would have to take God by surprise. And we'll immediately say, well, that can't happen because God can't be surprised. Okay, so if coincidence doesn't exist, then what does that mean? Well, that means that God has to be involved in every event, no matter how small or how large the event, and God is aware of all events at all times. Okay, well, that's kind of hard for us to understand as humans, but we have to realize God himself is not human. He became a human with Jesus, but God is not human. He can interact with all people at all times. He doesn't have to stop and say, I'm going to stop dealing with you, Jeremiah. I'm going to go over here and mess with this person over here. I'm going to go mess with this person. Then I'll come back to you and make an appointment, sort of thing. No, God can deal with every person at all times, in all places. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient and omnipresent. So, I mean, he's everywhere. He knows everything. And yet he's able to deal with even the smallest little detail with every person. So I'd say from the rise and fall of a nation to the rise and fall of a loaf of bread is kind of how God operates. So he's able to deal with the biggest things in the universe and able to deal with the smallest problem you might be dealing with. I've heard it said that some geneticists even say that God is actually involved in every single cell division. So in a human cell, plant cell, animal cell, they always divide, and then they have a lifespan. So cells are born, or well, they're not born, but they originate from another cell, and then they die, and then they have to reproduce to keep going. So that's how like dead skin cells form and so forth. It's because cells live and die. But in order to do that, they have to divide in order they can reproduce. And so the cell division process is so complicated that it's almost as if it's like an orchestra, or it's like a orchestra of all these different instruments. And you have to have someone there to get the orchestra to make music sound beautiful. Well, in the same way, the cells have so many different parts in them that you can't operate them by just random functions. They have to all work together. So you have to have some sort of conductor or orchestrator involved to make those cells work properly. So I get back to the point of that is that is God involved in every single cell operation and every single organism and every single plant and every single person and every single animal? It would seem so, and that kind of it's very hard to understand from a human perspective. So, a biblical definition of coincidence could be something similar to like a remarkable concurrence of events by God's providential arrangement of circumstances. So, whereas coincidence, from a secular perspective, would be a bunch of things happening without any sort of connection. A biblical definition would be a bunch of interesting things happening that God made happen, that God orchestrated. So if you really want to think hard on this, you could ask the question like, do things happen without God's involvement but with his knowledge? So that gets into a little philosophical / very complicated discussion on how God works. So do things happen without God actually orchestrating them, but he knows about them? Or does everything happen with God's involvement, specifically every little detail of history? And I'm going to not discuss that anymore because this lesson will go on for hours and hours. So let's move on. Okay. Now we're going to examine some of these things and kind of see how we can apply them. So first of all, let's get back to the sun and the moon stopping in the sky. So God answered Joshua's prayer and extended his day. We know that. We know that he did it. But now that we've talked about some of these astronomical terms and kind of how the planets and the stars work and so forth, and moons and so forth. So could the planet, I'm going to switch gears here. This is going to really kind of confuse you at first. So we do know that this happened. Now, how did it happen? So could the planet Mars be involved? Now, why do I say that? Why would Mars have anything to do with the sun and the moon stopping for Joshua? Well, let's go to history for a little bit. So a man named Donald Patton, he's a geographer, historian, and author. He actually passed away in 2014. He studied worldwide catastrophes over about a period of 1,800 years. This would include things like Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood, the long day of Joshua, for instance. And he partnered with a mathematician, physicist, an orbital analyst named Ronald Hatch, and Loren Steinhauer, who's a mathematical theorist. And they wrote several books, one, for instance, called The Long Day of Joshua and Six Other Catastrophes, which was released in 1971, and several other books that are actually public domain that are about these historical events. And they essentially take a lot of historical information and line it up with physical science regarding the solar system, astronomy, the physics of the planets, and perhaps some previous orbits that they may have been in our past, and try to rationalize some of these catastrophes on Earth with astronomical events by some of these planets and other objects. So again, it's hypothesis. It's can't be proved, but it's very fascinating because he uses very good information to come up with some of these ideas. And what he essentially hypothesized, without going through the entire book, is that the planet Mars may have actually had a different orbit than it does today. Not its own orbit, but it actually passed close to Earth every 108 years approximately. And that number's been thrown around. It could have been 108 years, and then every once in a while it would add 4 years to it, as the orbit of Mars and Earth essentially canceled each other out. They were resonant orbits, so every time Earth passed by, it would gain energy, and Earth would lose energy. So they would, the gravity and the interaction between the two would, over time, cancel each other out, and until eventually, around 701 BC, it's thought that these orbits stabilized and into their own orbits that we see today. So, but when these planets would pass by each other, there would be all kinds of interaction between the two bodies, gravitational interaction, electrical interaction, and it would really cause a lot of problems on Earth and also Mars. So this could potentially account for things like earthquakes, massive hailstones falling from the sky. We might call those meteors today. Landslides, and basically other catastrophes that are recorded in biblical and secular history. So we've got a table here from one of their books showing these dates and some of the history, some of the biblical events that actually line up with it, including the long day of Joshua, which would have been about 1404 BC approximately. And so many civilizations describe, what's interesting is their fear of the planet Mars. So when you look through history and civilizations talking about Mars, they either call it Mars or the war god or the god of war, or they give it other names. Some different civilizations call Mars by different names, and they usually attributed it to one of their gods. So, and if you go outside today and look at Mars, at its closest approach to Earth, it's just a tiny little red dot in the sky, and it just looks like a star. It looks like another object in the sky. So you kind of wonder why these civilizations describe fear and panic and utter just destruction on the Earth when this planet comes close to Earth. And you would think that maybe it's not completely unlikely that maybe this planet did come closer to Earth than it does today. So, but these events do seem to stop around 701 BC. And why? So, well, the idea is that, again, that maybe their resonant orbits, Earth and Mars's resonant orbits, eventually stabilized into their current orbits. But when Mars did pass by Earth, it would have caused all kinds of chaos on Earth, panic. If you can imagine seeing Mars coming up on the horizon with earthquakes starting, the waters rising on the Earth, huge landslides, lightnings, and just all kinds of interaction between the two planets. So many civilizations actually adjusted their calendars around this year. It's widely accepted that it was in 701 BC, and you ask why? Well, if eventually Earth stabilized and Mars stabilized in their own orbit, Earth would have gained a few more days, and Mars would have probably lost some days when you look at the math of it. So, and I'm not going to go through all those details. It's in the books, but civilizations like Arabia, Assyria, China, Egypt, obviously the Hebrews, Mayans even, Persia, Peru, Rome, they all in their history record adjusting their calendars around this time. And some of these civilizations used idols to represent the days in their calendar. So some went from 360 to 365 idols, and some have, obviously calendars kind of like we do, and they would adjust their solar calendars, their engravings of the calendar cycles to account for this date change. So it's kind of interesting that all these civilizations, most of them are completely unrelated to each other, and maybe weren't even aware of each other's existence. All adjusted their calendars around this time. So it's just kind of interesting that if Mars stopped coming by the Earth, maybe it did adjust the calendar in some way. So now the question is if this happened, what does this have to do with the long day of Joshua? Well, let's look at this. So a close flyby of Mars would cause the Earth's rotation to actually slow down due to the gravitational interaction between each of these planets. So when you have objects pass by each other in space, they generally interact gravitationally, and one might speed up and one might slow down. So in this case of Mars and Earth, Mars would actually speed up, but Earth would slow, and that would include the rotation of the planets. So in effect, to an observer on Earth, this effect would actually, believe it or not, the sun and the moon would stop. Everything in the sky would stop, and that would mean that anything in the daytime, be it the sun and the moon, would actually slow, even though they're slowly moving anyway, but they would actually stop for a while. So, and it would also cause some other effects. Of course, these massive tidal effects between the two objects would cause, like I said, earthquakes and other things. So if we read in Joshua 10 verse 11, which is right before our verse that talks about the long day, it says that as they, the enemies, fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So very interesting. So could these hailstones mentioned in Joshua 10:11 be the rocks from the asteroid belt? I only say that because Mars is actually hypothesized in this original hypothesis to have captured asteroids, meteors, and maybe even other small rocks from the asteroid belt each time it passed by, before and after it reached Earth. It's possible. Again, only God knows. So, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, is there any modern evidence of Mars making flybys to Earth? Let's talk about it. You might be surprised that the evidence that I'm about to discuss actually comes from a book called, and many of you might be familiar with this book. It's Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Now, this book is actually a children's book these days, but it used to be a political satire when it was written. So, in chapter 3 of this book, they are talking about an area called Laputa, which has these little people, and they are apparently expert astronomers, and they're bragging about what they can see in the sky. And it talks about Mars briefly. So it says they have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars or satellites which revolve around Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of his diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in the space of 10 hours, and the latter in 21.5, so that the squares of their periodical times are very near in the same proportion with the cubes of their distance from the center of Mars, which evidently shows them to be governed by the same law of gravitation that influences the other heavenly bodies. Okay, what does this mean? Well, this book was published in 1726, and obviously this little paragraph goes into some details about Mars and its 2 moons, given the approximate sizes and even orbital periods, I should say. And one might say, well, that's no surprise. I mean, we have astronomers that have good information about Mars and its moons now. Well, the interesting thing is the first official visual confirmation of Mars's moons didn't take place until about 150 years later, when they were discovered in 1877, so about 151 years after this book was published. And those 2 moons were named Phobos and Deimos, and they were discovered to be pretty closely, pretty accurate to the description in the book. Not perfectly, but strangely similar to the descriptions in Jonathan Swift's books. Deimos actually has a crater now named Swift, which is kind of funny. So, and I've got a couple of photos here of Phobos and Deimos, and you'll immediately notice that they don't look like your typical moons, your spherical moons at all. They actually look like small rocks or very unusually shaped asteroids or meteors. So is it possible that maybe these moons were picked up in the asteroid belt like this hypothesis actually specifies? Again, it's possible. Only God knows. So how can this be explained, the fact that Jonathan Swift knew the details of, and what does this have to do with any of this? I mean, what is the point of him knowing the details of the moons of Mars? Well, there's several ways that people try to explain this. One of them is that Jonathan Swift assumed Mars had 2 moons just because Earth has 1 and Jupiter has, well, at the time they thought 4. It actually has over 69 or 70 that we have discovered so far, but at the time it was thought that Jupiter had 4 moons because you could only see 4 of the largest Galilean moons. So they think, well, Jonathan Swift may have just assumed, let's give Mars 2 moons and then give all these details. Seems like a stretch to me, but we'll see. Galileo actually had a hidden report about discovering 2 bumps on the side of Saturn, which of course they later found out to be its rings. And he used an anagram that was misunderstood by Johannes Kepler, and thought it meant a description of Mars having, in the language was, hello, furious twins, sons of Mars. And maybe Jonathan Swift drew on that. Maybe, who knows? Or just a lucky guess. So there's another explanation, that's that possibly maybe Jonathan Swift was actually drawing on some past knowledge of ancient observations of the planet Mars when it passed really close to Earth, if it did. It's an interesting thought. Maybe, who knows? We can't really tell, obviously. So it's an interesting story. Maybe it's true. Again, only God knows. So if the Mars hypothesis is correct, the total hypothesis, then the implications of this are extraordinary. So what that would mean is if Mars did pass by Earth and all these things did happen, then that means that God ordained everything in the universe, including the stars, the planets, the asteroids, the meteors, even the little pebbles, to behave exactly as they have done. and are doing and will do in the future, to behave exactly like they did in the story of Joshua 10. So that means that God set the rocks in motion to land exactly where they did on Israel's enemies and no one else in Joshua 10:11. And maybe even the asteroids or the rocks, the fire and brimstone in Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe even the flood was a result of Mars coming by. Who knows? But the fact is that all these events happened because God wanted them to happen. But is it possible that maybe all of these events occurred by some natural means that he orchestrated? It's a fascinating thought if so, and I kind of like to think that that's the way God operates, in these unexplainable, just indescribable methods that he would use. So, but it's possible he just snapped his fingers and these things happened. So, and he didn't even have to snap his fingers. He could, just speak it or think it and it would happen, obviously. So regardless of his methods, God is in total control of the entire universe and everything inside and outside of it. So that said, let's go over the summary. It's going to be very brief because just 2 points, but the sun and moon standing still. Obviously God did it. He did it exactly the way he described it. And we can sit back in awe of God's majesty regardless of his methods that he chooses to accomplish his will. So the fact is it happened. All of these things in Scripture happened exactly the way he wanted them to happen. How exactly they happened, that we observe them, we don't know. But I'd like to think some of these methods that we've talked about are pretty neat. Maybe he did them that way. Maybe he didn't. It's not really a big deal, but it's fun to think about. So also divine providence and chance. Obviously, secular coincidence does not exist. At least I don't believe it does. But God is aware of everything all the time. Because if he wasn't, then we're in big trouble. Because that means God can be surprised by things, and I don't believe he can. And the Scripture seems to indicate he can't. So divine providence is in every little thing, in every big thing. And remember, like the rabbis say, coincidence is not a kosher word. So we have a couple of verses here as well. Psalm 33:8. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And of course, Isaiah 46:9-11. Remember the former things long past, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, all history, and from ancient times things which have not been done, so past and future, saying, my purpose will be established and I will accomplish all my good pleasure, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken. Truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. Surely I will do it. So we have a God that's in control of everything, all history, yet we are free to make those choices that cause these things to happen. How does that work? We don't know, but it works. And again, God is in control. He loves us, and he sent his word and his son to us to show us the plan of redemption. And again, this is just another strange scripture, and we'll see you soon for more.